Hi everybody, my name is Annika and this is my presentation for the applied assignment. In this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the pre-work and research that I did, as well as things that I learned and questions that I still have. So let's begin with the pre-work. For this assignment, the topic that I chose was accessibility and inclusion for differently abled children in preschool classrooms. This topic was significant and important for me because I'm a preschool teacher and I'm studying early childhood education, and the aspect of inclusion that I focused on was education. For my interview, I talked to Susie Moore, who's the director at the preschool where I work. She is an educator with experience in special education. And some more background on her experience. She worked as a shadow for a child who had several disabilities. So essentially her role was to provide one-on-one support for this child and help him in all of his day-to-day activities in the classroom. For my course materials, I used equity gaps for students with disabilities. I used this source in my research because it talks about the equity gap for students with disabilities, especially those who are people of color or low income. And I also used equity, parental/caregiver power, and disability policy in the US context. I used this source in my research because it discusses the Individuals with Disability Education Act. It also discussed parent and caregiver participation and teachers' role in access to services for children with disabilities. In my own research, I used Preschool Teaches Inclusion. Program helps children with disabilities, non-disabled classmates learn together. I used this source in my research because it talks about a program where children with and without disabilities are in a class together and the benefits of inclusion in that classroom. And for my other source, I used Inclusion for Young Children with Disabilities, a quarter century of research perspectives. I used this source in my research because it talks about the history of inclusion in early childhood education and preschool classes and just overall gave a lot of information. So let's get into my evidence. So for my evidence, I wanted to include some of the questions and the notes that I took during my interview with Susie. So the first question is, why is collaboration among parents, teachers, and therapists important when caring for a child with a disability? So essentially in my conversation with Susie, she talked about how when all of the adults are communicating, they stand a better chance of creating an effective plan to help the child be successful. When the parents are communicating, they can address changes in the child's sleep or eating habits, as well as changes in their medications. And it essentially just helps everyone be able to plan accordingly and give the child all the resources they need to be successful. The second question that I asked her was, do you believe it is beneficial for children with disabilities to be included in general education classes? Why or why not? She said that she does think it is important. She said that it can depend on the needs of the child. For example, if they have medical needs or if a nurse needs to be present. She said that it can be helpful for children to start in special ed classes and work their way into inclusive general education classes. And it's important for children to have exposure and experiences with other people. Okay, let's get into what I learned. For inclusion, I learned about obviously the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a law that requires public schools to essentially provide special education services to children with disabilities. However, private schools are not legally required to follow IDEA. Inclusion in preschool classes, even private schools, is still important, and it's beneficial for children with and without disabilities to learn and socialize together. In inclusive classrooms, children with disabilities thrive academically and socially. They're able to interact with their peers and learn from them as well. And children without disabilities are able to learn important skills like empathy, acceptance, and kindness. A quote I wanted to include from one of my sources is, "There's a real value for children who don't have disabilities to see that other children who are different from them are living the same lives they are and getting an educational experience and learning from it." This concept connects to the course material, one of the sources I mentioned earlier, which is Equity, Parental/Caregiver Power, and Disability Policy in the U.S. Context. It connects to this because it discusses IDEA and special education services that fit the specific needs of children with disabilities. The next thing that I learned about equity is that students with disabilities are often people of color or are low income. They consistently underperform academically, but this is not a result of their disability. It's because teachers and school systems often have implicit biases. Inclusion and differentiation, which is essentially changing the way that you teach to better fit the needs of the individual needs of students. Those are important and they can make a huge impact. However, they cannot be effective until educators recognize the cultural backgrounds and experiences of their students and adjust accordingly. Essentially, when they treat all of their students the same without taking their cultural differences or their experiences into consideration, they are unable to provide an inclusive education, essentially. The quote that I wanted to include for equity from this source that I used, it says, "In this commentary, we posit that this underperformance is not due to the learning challenges exhibited by students with disabilities or to the need for more specialized interventions outside the general education setting, as is commonly argued. Instead, these trends may be the result of the lack of intersectional analysis of the students with disabilities experience, many of whom face biases as low-income students of color in urban classrooms. This concept connects to the course material, which was also the source of that quote, Equity Gaps for Students with Disabilities, because it discusses the equity gap, implicit bias, as well as inclusion and differentiation." And lastly, what I learned about access is that preschool age children with disabilities having access to individualized support is an important part of their success. A crucial aspect of providing this support is collaboration among parents, caregivers, teachers, and therapists. Collaboration allows everyone to participate in planning care and creates consistency at home and at school. As I mentioned earlier with my interview with Susie, we discussed this as well. And experiences in my professional life, I do agree with this, that collaborating all of the adults collaborating really helps support the child and allows them to be successful and benefits their social and emotional and all of those important developments. And creating creating consistency at home and at school, as well as in their interactions with their therapists, whether it be occupational or speech or behavior or, whatever it is. Creating consistency really allows them to thrive. So for my quote for this, I quoted, "The success of inclusive programs was less about the characteristics of the children and more about the collaborative relationship among the adults." And this concept connects to the course because the ability for people to receive support is essential to accessibility. And now moving on to continued inquiry. What I want to learn more about is how early childhood teachers, such as myself, can create an inclusive environment in the classroom. Essentially, how can teachers address their biases? How can they provide support for children? How can they adjust the way that they teach and create more inclusive curriculums? And even going into the design of the classroom, how can the physical design be more inclusive as well? And I plan to learn more about this by continuing to learn more and educating myself, as well as continuing to interact and work with differently abled children in my career. And my question for my peers is, how will you contribute to inclusion, accessibility, and equity in your personal and professional life? So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching.